it's a great honor and pleasure to join this CEP webinar. I always enjoy involvement with CEP, and also it's great to be with these esteemed fellow panelists and with these participants and this audience. So let me talk about the global terror threat emanating from Afghanistan, how al-Qaeda and Isil, as well as their affiliates, reacted to the startling recent developments there, and what can we now expect to be the effect for their global networks. And I'll start by framing some questions and dichotomies that I raised at a recent discussion of the CT implications of these recent events. I wanted to stress to colleagues that the situation in Afghanistan remained unstable and unclear, still evolving. Too soon to draw clear conclusions, but not too soon to identify emerging risks and possible scenarios. So first of all, looking inside versus outside Afghanistan. So safe haven for al-Qaeda seems assured. If you look at the return of Amin al-Haq, who is one of the one of the first people listed on our sanctions list for al-Qaeda, his return to Nangarhar in August, amid phalanx of Taliban people with him, and evidently not camera shy. So this was very much a poke in the eye for anyone in the international community who was expecting that the Taliban would show some kind of restraint in terms of their, as Hans has put it, symbiotic relationship with al-Qaeda. So what will Afghanistan be for al-Qaeda in the near future? I think it's going to, it's a platform for planning, communication, recruitment, training, fundraising. But al-Qaeda has no current significant external operations capability. And what that means, of course, is it costs the Taliban and al-Qaeda nothing to refrain from attacks for the rest of this year, next year as well, maybe. That wouldn't have happened anyway. And therefore, for al-Qaeda to behave in the way that is not, that doesn't jar with the kind of image that the Taliban is trying to project, that's to be expected. But that doesn't mean to say that this is not a problem, because of course all of the things that it will be doing will ultimately equip it to become a more effective international terrorist organization. We should keep an eye on Saif al-Adl, of course, who's currently believed to be al-Qaeda's number 2. Ayman al-Zawahiri, as people will know, is still the leader of al-Qaeda, but is believed to be in poor health, probably ineffective as a leader at the moment, unable to communicate reliably. Now, if Saif al-Adl takes over, will he be able to leave Iran, where he's presently based? If he does leave Iran, I think he's probably more likely now to go to Afghanistan than we would have said before the events of this summer. We were wondering what his options were, and none of them were particularly appealing. But of course, he does have a history, personal history, and an operational track record in Africa. But I would say the suggestion from what we've seen so far from the Taliban is that they may well feel confident enough for him to return to Afghanistan. The prominence of Siraj Haqqani in the new government shows al-Qaeda influence runs very, very deep, and it casts doubts on any prospects for counterterrorism cooperation with the Taliban. Now, looking outside Afghanistan, the inspiration factor, the celebrations from al-Qaeda affiliates around the world, this is a huge inspiration for this strain of terrorism. Salafi jihadi takfiri terrorism, however we want to describe it. The example of taking over a state, what are the implications of that for al-Shabaab and their aspirations and their strategy? What about the aspirations of Janim in Mali and going into Burkina Faso? So I think we need to think about that, the possibility that there may be a sort of a renewed ambition of al-Qaeda affiliates to capsize or capture member states, fragile jurisdictions. Afghanistan is now newly attractive to foreign extremists. There's already a lot of chatter going on out there about people going to Afghanistan. But again, it's early to say how this will manifest in practice, and indeed how the Taliban will react. You know, it may not be very convenient for them to have an influx of foreign extremists. We don't know on this one, but and for now, it's still true that there are more Afghan veterans in Syria than there are veterans of Iraq and Syria in Afghanistan. But the whole notion of ISIL relocators, this is something we still need to take seriously as a potential threat in Afghanistan and then outside Afghanistan in the future. I also just float an interesting but very imprecise comparison to be made with Idlib in northwestern Syria. The juxtaposition there of jihadi nationalists, al-Qaeda, sort of global al-Qaeda, if you like, ISIL, and then foreign extremists of different stamps, some who are just there to enjoy life under Sharia, some who are sort of very happy to be foot soldiers or manners of checkpoints for the local jihadi nationalist authorities, whether that's HTS in Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Idlib, or whether it's the Taliban in Afghanistan. And then those who have a sort of an unquenchable desire to get involved in foreign attack planning, often directed at their countries of origin or countries of nationality, and therefore are drawn more to the international side of al-Qaeda or to ISIL. And then another sort of dichotomy between the sort of the al-Qaeda Taliban side of the equation in Afghanistan and ISIL. The Taliban takeover is more obviously good news for al-Qaeda than it is for ISIL. ISIL globally has reacted dismissively to the Taliban. You know, they're godless nationalists as far as ISIL are concerned. But the overall jihadi message will get a huge shot in the arm, with ISIL propaganda still effective and well presented, and of course also being read by people who are spending too much time on the internet, as they still don't get out as much as people used to. But the inspiration now available from this practical example of extremist success against the West, I guess you would say, is the way that it's generally being presented. The United States, of course, NATO. I think we have to accept that in these circumstances, and playing into the relaxation of COVID lockdowns, we must now anticipate an increased likelihood of inspired attacks in non-conflict zones. Is it possible that the Taliban will consolidate authority and then suppress ISIL-K, ISIL Khorasan, the Afghan affiliate of ISIL, which we continue to estimate, maybe sort of 2,000 plus in terms of its strength? But some people are saying that, yes, it's going to increase in strength, it's going to get bigger. But, the question is, what will the Taliban view be of this? Will there be divisions within the Taliban, and indeed amongst the patchwork of terrorist groups present in Afghanistan? Will there be maneuvering for position? What about unpredictable tactics? When you're talking about the Taliban, you're also talking about the Haqqani network. You're talking about a component there of the Taliban which has tactical autonomy to do whatever it judges to be in the strategic interests of the Taliban. Will we see hostage taking for ransom or for political advantage? Will we see them turning on and off CT assurances for political pressure? In that way, ISIL-K becomes a sort of a useful bogey for the Taliban to scare the international community with. What about exploiting the ambiguous links between the Haqqani network and some ISIL-K elements? But then again, of course, ISIL-K, as I say, it may grow, it may attract dissident Taliban and foreign terrorist fighters who aren't ready to stop fighting, and not ready to stop benefiting from the economics of conflict. And Hans mentioned the the narcotics side so eloquently that I'll say very little by way of adding to it. But just the point that, of course, part of a war economy and part of conflict economic dynamics is that people don't want to give this stuff up if they're asked to do so, and that means that it's another reason why for the Taliban, if they did want to clamp down on or exert more control over the drug trade, again, there's a danger that this just shifts some people who are doing very nicely in present circumstances, who then would prefer to abandon the Taliban. What about Uzbeks, Tajiks, Turkmen, ethnic or indeed in some cases even nationals with ambitions in Central Asia? What about the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, which is actually, if we don't include the Taliban, because the way they're sanctioned by the UN is as a threat to peace and security in Afghanistan, and indeed not the group itself as a whole, but just individual Taliban. So the UN doesn't refer to the Taliban as terrorists. Well, in which case the TTP is the largest terrorist group in Afghanistan in terms of its numbers, and they've reiterated allegiance to the Taliban, but there's an obvious unstable dynamic there because of the strategic relationships with neighbors. Certainly, the borders of Afghanistan look insecure. Tajikistan and Turkmenistan look at particular risk of infiltration by both extremists and criminals. The availability of arms and materiel in Afghanistan, and the country is just awash with weapons. It's in economic and public health crisis. People are in desperate need. To what extent does this fuel violent crime, render it impossible to suppress the drug trade, allow weapons to fall into the hands of various terrorist groups? We should beware of seeing the situation or the implications as stable or fixed. It is fluid and evolving. Drawing precise conclusions about individual regions or countries and how they might be affected by the ripple effect from Afghanistan is really difficult. But I think what we can say is this is a hugely significant moment for the evolution of the global terrorist picture, and it will need continuous monitoring. I'll mention just briefly the if you like, parochial aspects of this from the monitoring team's point of view and the mandates in New York. The Security Council will need to think carefully about how this plays into this autumn's mandate renewals. It will be necessary to adopt consistent resolutions updating the tasking of the monitoring team on both 1267 and 1988, in other words, on Isil and al-Qaida, and also on the Taliban. The Taliban want sanctions lifted. They argue that that was promised to them in the Doha Agreement of February 2020. So, almost any conversation with the Taliban starts off with them saying, well, why should we do anything until you fulfilled the promise that was made to us that we would no longer be blacklisted? There are, we've been counting it up. It's been increasing. Initially, we counted 19 sanctioned Taliban in the provisional cabinet that they announced. That number may now have crept up to 21, which does feel a little bit like a poke in the eye again. The Taliban are pretty good at poking people in the eye. The humanitarian dimension of this is already demanding attention. But I won't go further on that at the moment, but certainly we can get into that in question and answer if people are interested in how that may play out in terms of how the international community addresses these challenges. I will just say that I think Afghanistan may serve as a wake-up call for those who are growing complacent about this strain of terrorism. There were victory narratives and talk of bringing the troops home. I think in a way this is a useful corrective to the idea that this strain of terrorism was on the wane. It isn't. Perhaps I can end my presentation with a sort of brief tour d'horizon of global and regional counterterrorism issues. And this is based on sort of an update of the last 1267 report that we published online in July. So the pandemic is having an enduring impact on terrorism and counterterrorism. It's exacerbated the threat in conflict zones, and it's artificially suppressed the threat in non-conflict zones, where travel restrictions and lockdowns have real effect. But that is a short-term effect, and we should expect attacks to increase in non-conflict zones when public health measures are relaxed, as I said earlier. As for the medium to long term, the toll of COVID-19 on economies, on the reputations of governments, and on international cooperation will likely aggravate underlying factors conducive to violent extremism and terrorism. So the threat in both conflict zones and non-conflict zones will increase. The issue of foreign terrorist fighters and the different but related issue of people still stranded in territory of the former so-called caliphate, especially northeastern Syria. These are major policy challenges and long-term threat multipliers. There's an incubating threat, and how actively and successfully we mitigate it now will be of great significance to our successors and future generations. Particularly tragic and requiring protection are minors stuck in camps. Do we really want innocent and harmless small children to grow into teens in a brutalizing, radicalizing environment? I always tell the story that I heard from Indonesian interlocutors who told us about the child of one of the Bali bombers, who was 4 years old when his father committed the attack, and was recently, 2019, a foreign terrorist fighter killed in Syria. It's really important to stress the generational challenge here, because officials and politicians tend to be on fixed term or short term cycles. They're worrying about the next election, or they're thinking about where they might be posted or where they might be promoted. And they rarely think beyond 5 years. But that Indonesian example is an absolutely clear-cut call to think 15 years or 20 years. In terms of the key regions, I think I've dealt sufficiently with South Central Asia and Afghanistan, and I've touched upon the Middle East, both of them being regions of primary counterterrorism concern. Isil and al-Qaida are primarily headquartered and based in these regions. Iraq and Syria remain at the heart of ISIL's identity. But both al-Qaida and ISIL have delegated autonomy to affiliates far from the core. And the other big story of 2021 so far has been the spread of extremism and terrorism in Africa. When I briefed the committee in July, Africa was my main focus. And the things that we were looking at, especially in the report, were Somalia, of course, enduring threat from al-Shabaab to that country. As I said, maybe inspired even more now by events in Afghanistan. Threat to the region from al-Shabaab, especially Kenya, and perhaps globally, because there's a history of foreign terrorist fighters with al-Shabaab. There's a Somali diaspora, very widespread, and Cholo Abdi Abdullah, this Kenyan national who at al-Shabaab's behest was being trained as a pilot in the Philippines. You don't train an operative as a pilot if you don't have some residual global terrorist attack ambitions. Now then you have ISIL Somalia, which is the hub of ISIL's Central and Eastern Africa network. And that segues into the DRC and Mozambique, where ISCAP is in contact with Somalia and locally active in both of these places. Now, one of the most striking developments of 2021 so far was IS Central Africa Province, or ISCAP, assault on the port of Palma in the far north of Cabo Delgado province in Mozambique, just south of the border with Tanzania. Now, ISCAP have also mounted cross-border attacks into Tanzania, and many of their fighters are of Tanzanian origin. That region is far from Dar es Salaam and even further from Maputo. ISCAP is strong, it's emboldened, it's well-resourced with spoils looted from areas that it has invaded and temporarily controlled. Although the international community is moving to support Mozambique, the likelihood is that ISCAP will expand its activities before counterterrorism measures take full effect. ISIL's West Africa network is headquartered in the Lake Chad Basin, where it achieved a major success earlier this year in killing Abu Bakr Shekau and routing and or recruiting his Boko Haram faction. The Nigerian and neighboring authorities have struggled to cope with the threat from ISWAP, and the group has now increased in size and the threat that it is able to pose. ISWAP has a lesser affiliate far to the west in the tri-border area of the Sahel between Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, where it struggles generally unsuccessfully against the larger and more effective al-Qaida coalition, Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin, or JNIM. JNIM has destabilized Mali and is now destabilizing Burkina Faso. It's mounted operations in Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire. It pursues a policy of exploiting existing ethnic, tribal, and cultural divisions and radicalizing society through polarization and intimidation. Like al-Shabaab in Somalia, it may be emboldened by the Taliban's example to think it can entirely capsize a fragile member state. So where does all this leave the global threat from this strain of terrorism? As I said earlier, low but rising in non-conflict zones, high and rising in conflict zones. It isn't clear that events in Afghanistan have immediate implications for the threat on the streets of Europe or North America, although even as we speak, the risk of inspired attacks is rising. It may be a 2 or more stage process whereby al-Qaeda especially embeds in failed states before raising its sights to project a directed international threat. But that is its nature, and we must expect that to materialize eventually. So thank you. I'll leave it there, but we'll be ready to respond to questions, enter into discussion on any of these issues, and indeed any subject related to the monitoring team's mandate.